Good evening. Welcome, everyone. So, this is the fifth of a series of 6 talks as introduction to the Diamond Sutra. And as I've mentioned each week, my intention here is not to explain the Diamond Sutra, but to try to develop some connection with the Diamond Sutra, so that you feel like you have some faculty to befriend and be befriended by this sutra. Sometimes it doesn't always feel like a friend, but a companion, maybe that's a better word, and so that you can benefit from a deep relationship with the Diamond Sutra over a lifetime or over lifetimes. It's not something that we just consume and then put to the side. It's something that it's a gateway. It's really an offering to us from the Buddha to transform the way it is that we see the world, the way that we are in the world, and that's really the quality of all sutras. We say they're a wonderful medicine. They're not just a description, but they're an invitation into a transformation and a healing, so that we can overcome this fundamental ignorance which causes suffering for ourselves and for the world. So, having said that, like we did last week, I'd like for us to just recite these first 5 chapters that we're working with together. We won't recite the titles of each of the chapters. We'll just read the text itself. The Diamond Sutra.
Thus have I heard. Once the Bhagavan was dwelling near Shravasti in the Anantapatingala garden of Jeddah forest, together with the full assembly of 1,250 monks. One day before noon, the Bhagavan put on his patched robe, picked up his bowl, and entered the capital of Shravasti for offerings. After begging for food in the city and eating his meal of rice, he returned from his daily round in the afternoon. Putting his robe and his bowl away, he washed his feet and sat down on the seat set aside for him. After crossing his legs and adjusting his body, he turned his attention to what was before him. A number of monks then came up to where the Bhagavan was sitting. After touching their heads to his feet, they walked around him to the right 3 times and sat down to one side. On this occasion, the Venerable Subhuti was also present in the assembly. Rising from his seat, he uncovered one shoulder and touched his right knee to the ground. Pressing his palms together and bowing to the Buddha, he said, "It is rare, Bhagavan, most rare indeed, Sugata, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, blesses bodhisattvas with the best of blessings. And it is rare, Bhagavan, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, entrusts bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts. Even so, Bhagavan, if a noble son or daughter should set forth on the bodhisattva path, how should they act? How should they practice? How should they control their thoughts?" The Buddha told the Venerable Subhuti, "Well said, Subhuti, well said. So it is, Subhuti. It is as you say. The Tathagata blesses bodhisattvas with the best of blessings and entrusts bodhisattvas with the greatest of trust. You should therefore listen, Subhuti, and ponder this well. I shall tell you how someone who sets forth on the bodhisattva path should act, how they should practice, and how they should control their thoughts." The Venerable Subhuti answered, "May it be so, Bhagavan," and gave his full attention. The Buddha said to him, "Subhuti, those who would set forth on the bodhisattva path should think this thought. However many beings there are in whatever realms of being might exist, whether they are born from an egg or born from whether they have form or no form, whether they are able to perceive or not perceive, or neither perceive nor not perceive, in whatever conceivable realm of being one might conceive of beings. In the realm of unconditioned nirvana, I shall liberate them all. And though I thus liberate countless beings, not a single being is liberated. And how so? Subhuti, a bodhisattva to whom the conception of a being occurs, cannot be called a bodhisattva. And why is that? Subhuti, no one can be called a bodhisattva who conceives of a being, a life, or a soul. Moreover, Subhuti, when a bodhisattva gives a gift, they should not be attached to an object. When they give a gift, they should not be attached to anything at all. They should not be attached to a sight when they give a gift, nor should they be attached to a sound, a smell, a taste, a thought, or a dharma when they give a gift. Subhuti, bodhisattva should give a gift in this manner without being attached to any conception of its characteristics. And why is that? Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached isn't easy to measure. What do you think, Subhuti? Is the space to the east easy to measure? Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, likewise is the space to the south, to the west, to the north, in between, above, below, or in any of the 10 directions easy to measure? Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, in the same way, Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached isn't easy to measure. Thus, Subhuti, those who set forth on the bodhisattva path should give a gift without being attached to any conception of its characteristics. What do you think, Subhuti? Can the Tathagata be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes? Subhuti replied, no, Bhagavan. The Tathagata cannot be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes. And why not? Bhagavan, the Tathagata speaks of the acquisition of attributes as the acquisition of no attributes. The Buddha then told the Venerable Subhuti, since attributes are a fabrication, Subhuti, no attributes are no fabrication. Hence, by means of attributes that are no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen.
Wonderful. So maybe we'll start out tonight if there's any questions stemming from last week's presentation or other things that have come up. One attribute of being a monk is you get good at long, awkward silence. Maybe not awkward. It's fine if there's no questions. Okay, well, we'll jump in and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so this might jog some of your explorations or thoughts over the week. So tonight, I'm going to start talking about the fifth section a bit, which is titled The Principle of Thusness and True Seeing. I've been talking about the central theme in the Diamond Sutra, which is the body of merit. What in our translation is referred to as the hard-to-measure body of merit, or the body of liberation, or the liberated body. This is really central to to Buddhism. This question of what is awakening is not theoretical. It's actual. What is a life of liberation? What is it to meet a Buddha? What is it to see a Buddha? How does a Buddha appear in the world? Not some kind of just ideal about how things could be, but how do we meet this awakening, which we are told is ever present throughout the world, including throughout our own being. One way we can understand these first few chapters of the sutra is all some kind of working with this question of what is a Buddha, or what is this body of liberation, or what is merit? What is this quality of liberation which changes our lives? And that the first chapter is like a showing of the body. Right? This is just a simple explanation of a day in the life of Buddha. Very simple, very subtle, very clear. But this is how a Buddha shows up in the world. It's not cosmic, just simple and present. Maybe that's the most cosmic thing there is, actually. Right? Many sutras, when the Buddha emerges, there's many miraculous things happening. In the Lotus Sutra, for example, another sutra that we study here at Buddha Eye quite a bit, is just full of all of these stupendous things happening. Massive stupa that's larger than the whole world, it's encrusted with jewels, emerges from the ground and rises up into the sky with an ancient Buddha. And countless Buddhas and their attendants gather from all of the myriad universes, and all of them quake simultaneously as the doors of the stupa open, and Shakyamuni Buddha takes his place next to this ancient Buddha. Very cosmic. But here in the Diamond Sutra, we have this very simple life of the monk Gautama. And this is a real miracle, that this can be so simple and straightforward. A monk and his followers together, attending to this body of freedom. And then in the second chapter, which is what I'm going to talk about next week, although I'm getting my second shot on the morning of next week, so we'll see how it goes. If I would get a little feverish, I'm not sure how it would be, but anyway. In the second one, one way we can understand it is this is a chapter about entrusting the body. The Buddha isn't simply the body of liberation on his own. The only way that the Buddha can be the body of liberation is that that body of liberation is shared, that it is entrusted. And Subhuti notices that, and he says, it is amazing how you trust us. This being which is beyond all of the leveraging that humans normally do, and yet you're entrusting us. You trust in us. But even so, how should we do this? And then the Buddha says, yeah, I will entrust you. I do entrust you. It's right. I already trust you. And I will teach you. I will tell you what it means to exhibit this body. And then in the third and the fourth, he does that. He talks about what's the source of this body of liberation and what's the practice of it. He says the source is this thought of total liberation for all beings, a thought that is so huge that it includes any possible being that we have recognized, and all the beings which we do not have the capacity to recognize or have not yet recognized, in any possible form. So a thought that is so all-encompassing that all of those beings are invited, or all of them have their place there. But that in that thought, actually there are no beings. Right? That's why every being can be invited. And then he says, but if you're going to do that, that can't be enacted in abstraction. So you should give a gift. And you should give a gift that is in accord with that source. This is how you enact that thought. Right? You give a gift. And in giving that gift, you go beyond this limitation of grasping onto a self and an other that we do all the time. And then in the 5th chapter, then the Buddha talks about knowing the body or seeing the body. This principle of thusness and true seeing is it's kind of hard to understand it in the English, but in the Chinese, the principle of thusness, that thusness, right, is the tata of the Tathagata. So in the 5th chapter, when he's talking about can the Tathagata be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes, that Tathagata is one of the epithets, or is one of the names for the Buddha. Right? In this form, the Tathagata means the thus come one. Right? And that's how it's written in Chinese. So here, the title, the principle of thusness and true seeing, that principle of thusness, the thusness, is the Tathagata. It is the thus come one. Right? So it is the principle of that thusness is a question about what is the Buddha. It's a question about what is the body of liberation. Right? What is the one who comes thus? And what is the true seeing of that Tathagata? What is the way to truly see that Tathagata? Or what is the way that that Tathagata sees? We could say both. And I've mentioned several times that in the Chinese, things are wonderfully ambiguous this way. So sometimes, we think like Zen is so confusing. And it's confusing because one of the reasons it's confusing is because the language that Zen really grew up in has a simpler way of relating words than English does. And I don't mean simple as in less sophisticated. I mean that you don't nail as many things down. The subject-object relationships, which is modifying which, are very flexible within Chinese. Right? There's a typical interpretation. Most people would read it and say, oh, it could be read like this. But much of the commentary on various writings in Chinese in the Buddhist schools are simply someone telling you what order to read the characters in. Dogen is famous for this. Dogen, the founder of this school of Buddhism in Japan. He will say, most people will read these characters this way, but actually that's wrong. You should read them this way, and explaining how to interpret the relationship between the different words. But English nails it down a lot. Right? So if we think about a word like seeing, even to say seeing rather than sight or to see, we are always shifting between like a verb or a noun. But in Chinese, it's just a character. And from the context, you have to figure out, is it being used as a verb? Is it being used as a noun? Is it being used as it could be used as an adjective? Right? So there's this kind of beauty in Chinese. In the Prajnaparamita Sutras, we're really unclear what their original language was. Many people believe that they must have been Sanskrit because that's older, but we're actually not sure if it's older. So it's quite a conundrum for the scholars, but it's a liberation for us because we get to just learn from all of it. We don't have to worry about nailing it down. Anyway, I'm kind of going off on a sidetrack here, but the point being that when we're talking about this seeing, it's very easy for us to think only in terms of what does it mean to see a Buddha? How's a Buddha going to show up, right? And that's maybe the question that Subhuti really has. How do we do that, Buddha? Right? But equally, the question has to do with how do I see? How am I seeing? Right? And even how am I seen? And what is the nature of seeing itself? What is the nature of knowing? All of those are wrapped up in an investigation of what it means to see. And seeing here, I'm also using the term knowing, because seeing, we're talking about sight, but sight becomes a metaphor for being able to identify something. We use that all the time, right? We use sight as a metaphor for having understood something, or being able to locate something, or to identify something, even if it's not directly related with our visual cortex, right? Thank you. Nicely done. Yeah. So, to revisit a little bit of what I was presenting last week, it's important for us to see how addicted we are to investing in an outside form, into an object of awareness, or an object of our interest. That this is fundamental to the way that we walk around in the world. We say, I experience things, right? And we have even if we are quite studied in a philosophy or practice in Buddhism, even if we, on some level, really trust that things don't just appear to us, there's the illusion that things just appear, that there is a world that has permanence aside from me, and that I'm walking around in it, right? And that it's independent of my walking around in it. And that when I come across an object, that I'm simply coming across something which is there, and I happen to bump into it. Now, it's important for us to see that that is an investment. That's a certain way of regarding seeing. It's a certain way of investing in a phenomena. And I'm not suggesting that phenomena should go away, or that objects of consciousness or seeing we should try to get rid of them. But we're addicted to this way of seeing, in which we just say, that is a thing that's out there. And I could learn more about it if I pay close attention to it, if I measure various parts of it, right? Either in an informal way of trying to find the edges, through my thinking, or I could actually take a ruler up there and measure it, or a scale, or an electron microscope, or whatever kind of thing what tool I might want to use to understand the object. But I'm quite sure that it's out there. And that's what we typically label as seeing or knowing. It has to do with finding an edge of something, and then being able to identify it based on the edge. To be able to grasp it cognitively, to conceive of it, is to be able to see that shape. So we talk about this a lot in Buddhism. It's really good to go through the kind of exercise of, holding something and looking at it really, directly. And then you can consider some interesting things about it, like how are you able to see this glass? What has to happen for you to be able to conceive of the glass? There's a huge amount of cognitive work that's going on for that to happen. You have to be able to distinguish this form from all the background colors. You ever notice that your eyes are completely awash in sensation? But somehow, if I go like this and call your attention to the glass, 99.99999% of the information that's entering into your eyes recedes into the background, and you can latch on to this glass. It just happens automatically, if you have good eyesight. And if you add a little sound, it helps, because it convinces you that this glass is real. Right? I'm not saying it's not real, right? But I'm saying that we invest in it in a particular kind of way. It's very out here. So that's one aspect, just to be able to pick it out from everything, to be able to recognize it as a glass. You have all these experiences with glasses that have clear liquid in them. Right? So you start to associate all of those things, and the phenomena of a glass starts to emerge. It isn't just about some materiality which we are pretty sure is outside of us, but the phenomena of the glass is really infinitely complicated. There's a lot of Buddhist doctrine or teaching which dissects that and helps us see into that more deeply. I think it's all kind of very, very interesting stuff. Like, have you ever thought about how it is that you perceive depth? A fun thing you can do is you can just take like some unit of your anatomy, like your nail of your finger, and you can hold it at arm's length, and you can measure things that are really different sizes, but you measure what is the amount of space they're taking up on your retina, and it'll be just the same. The squish people's head game? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That when I was a middle school teacher, that was one of the favorite games at that time, is to squish people's heads. So why, what would that be? What's interesting about that is like things that are closer, like I'm thinking Okyoku here is like maybe 2 thumbs, on over there. Your 2 thumbs are in a chair. Doku's 1 thumb, because things go back and forth. But how do we interpret that? We interpret it as distance. We interpret it as distance because we have a sense of what the size of a human form is. Right? And so we interpret the distance based on that. Now, if you were really, really big, but you were like a couple blocks away, I'll probably think you're closer, right? Because the size wouldn't correspond with the human form, I thought. I once read a thing about when they took people who lived in a very dense forest out to the plains, that they thought things were small. They thought that the elephants that were in the distance were little, because they didn't have that quality of depth perception. They also said that they learned almost immediately that it was different than that. They didn't stay there, right? A very plastic mind. So it's very quick.
The Spaniards who first looked into the Grand Canyon estimated that the river was about, maybe 8 or 10 feet in width.
And that was even before they started pumping all the water out of it.
Oh, yeah. 16th century.
Yeah. So this is fun to think about, and actually I think important to think about, because it's one of the clues that we have about the way it is that we invest in things. The way that we invest in the exteriority of an object, that the phenomena that we encounter are wholly out there. And in that way of perceiving things, we do something. And in that investing in a certain way, we reify, or we invest, double down in the subject-object relationship. That thing is out there, I'm an observer, and that is the observed. But when we begin to talk about an immeasurable or ungraspable body, this thusness, or this thus come one, the Tathagata, we know that we're not talking about something which can be grasped in the conventional way. That this thing which appears thus is not simply an object of our awareness. In fact, this thing that appears this way is giving us a medicine that will disturb our way of seeing the world in simply objectified way, is inviting us into another possibility of seeing. And this other possibility of seeing is immensely freeing. That we don't have to be in a world of subjects and objects, of which we are the subject and the object all the time. The Diamond Sutra, one way we can understand the Diamond Sutra, or really all of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, which are sometimes referred to as the Buddha eye. The Buddha mother, Buddha eye, is one of the epithets for the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So the Buddha mother is the womb of the Buddhas, is birthing Buddhas constantly. And that is also known as the Buddha eye, as the aperture from which the whole world is springing forth. both a womb and an eye have that same quality. The Diamond Sutra is inviting us to that aperture of a Buddha, to that birthing of a Buddha, to that eye, to that pupil, right? To that exchange which happens miraculously through this empty space of our pupil, where sight emerges, and forms can appear. But what would it be for forms to appear that are not simply this kind of externalized object or phenomena? This is what the Diamond Sutra is inviting us into. Now, I have to say, before we continue, if this all just sounds very confusing, that's normal. Okay? That's normal. And in one way, it's like an indication of how invested we are in this way of seeing that's just like, I'm here and it's out there, right? But it's also because this thing is so simple, but it can't be, it can't be seen. This is a story of how we see, not seeing how we see. You see the difference there? Like, it's a story about how we see. It's not a description of how we see, which would be how we see now becomes an object, which we can describe, and it can be a thing out there, which we could say, oh yes, when we're seeing, there's a lens, and the light's going through the lens, and it's happening like that. That's not an alive, vibrant story of seeing. It is an objectified map of seeing. But the Diamond Sutra is saying, no, see. Let's deal with seeing directly. And so anything that's like that, we don't get to grasp it. We don't get to grasp it as an explanation. And because we don't get to grasp it as an explanation, it's working on us in a different way. It's not giving us this description for us to be able to understand. It's giving us an invitation to shifting the way it is that we see. So that's why this way of speaking really is confounding, because we're always looking to extract the meaning. We're looking to extract the understanding. Now, I'm not saying that you should just give up. That's not the point. You have to keep listening. You have to keep paying attention to the words. Just like to see, you have to keep looking. You don't see and then you have seen. Like that's no longer seeing. Once you say, I saw it, you're not seeing anymore. You're just looking at a picture in your head. Right? So seeing is not something you have done. It is something which is continually happening. And I mean that literally with seeing, but I mean metaphorically with seeing. Perceiving, consciousness. Right? To be conscious is continual. It isn't a thing that happens and then it's over with. It's a raging river which doesn't stop for us to explain the quality of the waves. But of course, consciousness can also come up above. The river can split into two, and now the consciousness that's the river above can describe the river that's below. No problem. But that's all one river, right? It's not really two rivers. That split happens again and again and again and again and again and again through our whole being. Okay, so the Diamond Sutra is trying to work in that terrain. It's trying to, readjust our carburetor maybe. I have a truck that still has a carburetor. How many people know what a carburetor is? Okay, I was checking. Yeah, you know. We could talk about that later, but another kind of aperture for gas and air. So this question of attributes shows up here in this chapter, and it's a funny word, attributes. In Sanskrit, there are a few different words that correspond to this, and in the Chinese writing, there's a couple different words that get alternated throughout the sutra, but I don't want to get into the technicalities of that. I want us to just think of attributes as they are the qualities of something which allow us to grasp it. Right? So if we go back to the glass, We could say the glass has all kinds of attributes, right? It has, you would quickly say it's clear. You would say it's glass because it's clear. If it wasn't clear, you would have some question. Is it plastic? Is it made out of, earthenware? Is it, there would be different possibilities. But because it's clear, you probably, it's glass or maybe crystal. It could be plastic too, until I did this, and then you were pretty sure it wasn't plastic, right? So that would be an example of an attribute that you could separate from its shape, for example, right? Or its size, or other things. So when we talk about attributes, sometimes called marks, sometimes called characteristics, they all have to do with how it is that we develop a conception of something. We take certain pieces of a phenomena and it fits together to tell us what the thing is, right? And we're using, again, visual things here, but the marks are not only visual, they're through all of our different capacities for conceiving of something. Classically in Buddhism, that's eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So all of those have corresponding characteristics which help us understand what something is. So as we're investing in the outsideness of an object, of the independent existence of an object which is independent of us, these characteristics are one of the ways that we do it. We say, it's clear. It makes this kind of sound. It has this size. It's shaped in a way that it can hold this clear liquid, et cetera, et cetera. And now that thing that I'm looking at becomes an object of my awareness. I can hold on to it through its attributes. Now, when we're working through that fundamental ignorance that thinks that beings are and objects are independently arising, that's the very thing that drives the subject and object relationship. For me to perceive the object, I have to become a perceiver. I become the subject of the perceiving. And I have to project the existence of that thing out there. So Buddhism says that's a fundamentally ignorant attitude, to regard the world in that way. Because it doesn't recognize the deep inner penetration from which that sight is emerging. I'm only thinking about it in one side. But I regard things that way all the time. If you're really honest with yourself, you see like 99.9% of the time, that's how, even if you're doing really good 99.9% of the time, that would be how you're regarding the various things that you see. And there's a lot of functionality to that too. Like it super helps not getting hit by cars to regard them as wholly and completely outside of you, right? Like just in the moment. Right? But you don't have to stay there. Right? There's actually, it's very functional. Just, a Buddha doesn't get hit by cars either, right? They can also see cars just fine, but they don't regard them as objects that are simply outside of themselves. Okay, so I hope that it has some clarity to it. What I want to introduce here is something that I think is just beautifully radical about the Buddha Dharma. Actually, seeing is always thus. There is no way to see something without the thusness of the entirety of being present in that seeing. There would be no sight without total interpenetration of phenomena. So something that we regard in this very objectified way, that we create an object and a subject out of, essentially is not hindered in any way, even by our delusion, even by us saying, Genjo's over there and I'm over here. Even I invest in that. The fact of seeing itself is thus. It simply is how seeing happens. That a subject and object are totally interrelating with each other, are completely dependent upon each other. They're arising dependently. We can't avoid it, even with all of our investment in the one side of things. This is always completely and total functioning of life. So if we take that and then we come to this 5th chapter, and the Buddha, after explaining the source and then explaining the practice, right? Explaining the source of the Mahayana, what really is this great vehicle about? And then saying, this is how you practice it. He's now going to work with Subhuti about what does it mean to know it? What does it mean to know this thing? What does it mean to see it? Right? What does it mean to meet it? And he says, what do you think, Subhuti? Can the Tathagata be seen by means of the acquisition of attributes? Right? Some technical language in there. He says, Subhuti, what do you think? Can you see a Buddha? Can you recognize a Buddha by what they look like? And Subhuti says, no, Bhagavan, the Tathagata cannot be seen by the means of acquisition of attributes. And why not, Bhagavan? The Tathagata speaks of the acquisition of attributes as the acquisition of no attributes. So that gets a little bit more complicated. But first he says, no, you can't just invest in the outside world. I know that, right? That's not where you're going to see a Buddha. A Buddha is not going to be an object of your perception. Right? That in fact, any attribute which I see is not really an attribute. Any attribute which I see is not just something that's out there. It is the total dynamic seeing. It is the total dynamic activity of consciousness. It's not a thing out there. It is that raging river, right, that I am experiencing. Even if I might call it a Buddha, or I may call it a slug, but it's all part of that. And then the Buddha goes on to say, since the attributes are fabrication, Subhuti, no attributes are no fabrication. So the attributes, if I'm recognizing things by their marks, by all these characteristics, that's a fabrication. I'm creating something. If there's no attributes, I'm not creating anything. And this last line, in our translation it says, hence by means of attributes that are no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen. This is the typical way of interpreting this line. Again, Dogen Zenji, the founder of our school, says, he has some words like this is the flaming spittle of demons or something like that. He's quite colorful when he's criticizing other people's interpretation of things. Anyway, he's quite insistent that we read this a different way. He says that we should read it, hence, by means of attributes and no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen. Now, I think both of these readings have their merit. If Dogen was here, I probably wouldn't argue with him because he was he's wicked smart. So picking a debate wouldn't be so good. But since he's not, or at least not in the way that he's going to speak to me directly, I probably should be careful what I say. I would say that I appreciate that he was so insistent about putting the and there, and I think that is actually the better translation. But to read in the first way, hence by means of attributes that are no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen. This is one of the reasons I like this translation, because it plays with this. Many of the translations say, hence by means of attributes that you see as no attributes. Like they encourage you to see the attributes as no attributes. But here, he says, by means of attributes that are no attributes. This one is closer. Like any attribute that we see, any characteristic that we see, is not fundamentally the characteristic that we're investing in. It totally is that, but it also is not that in the way that we invest in it. So I like that translation, okay. Attributes that are no attributes. Any attribute we see, it is fully and completely the attribute. But whatever that attribute is a no attribute. It can't be grasped, right? It simply is seeing. And the dynamic activity of seeing can never be grasped. We just simply see. But that's so simple that we want to build a castle, and guard it. In Dogen's insistence here, he says, by means of attributes and no attributes, the Tathagata can indeed be seen. Now, the reason I think this is the better translation is because it values both the attributes and the no attributes. It's a big disease in our school, in the Zen school, that people are trying to undercut phenomena. And Buddha diagnosed this as one of the fundamental imbalances of a human heart, that we long for being, and then we long for non-being. First we long for sense pleasure, and then we long for, or we grasp onto being, and then we grab onto non-being. One way to think about that is like, ice cream's good, right? But that's all it is. Like, sense pleasure is groovy, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental questions of a human heart. So we can indulge that sense pleasure, but it doesn't end up scratching the itch, and usually creates a lot of problems because we go into overdrive on the sense pleasure because it's not getting us what we want. So in that process, we tend to crave after being. I'm going to be this kind of person, right? I'm going to become this. And it's all about being and becoming and having your place and your position and all those kinds of things. That eventually doesn't work. For some people it doesn't, the place that it doesn't work is on your deathbed. But for most of us it happens before that. We see that that's really a crumbling proposition. And so what do? And this is the disease of spiritual people, very strong disease of spiritual people, particularly Zen, people attracted to Zen. We say, fuck it. Knock it all down, right? And that's what will be true. And so that mind that wants to call all attributes no attributes can very easily be that mind, where you're just grasping after the non-being. But so Dogen's interpretation here, Dogen's insistence is that attributes and no attributes, to see both of them is to see the Tathagata. We don't insist that the stream appear as the oneness of a stream. The real oneness of a stream is all of the complexities and difficulties of a life. It's all the little sinewy stuff that you touch every day that makes your life thick and wonderful and difficult. It's all in there. If you think about your body, if you think about bodies, all the little weird things that make these work, it's miraculous and creepy. That is attributes and no attributes. Not to dismiss the attributes as no attributes, but the attributes themselves are no attributes. That's why they can be so wonderfully miraculous and creepy. That's why they can be totally embedded in each other. And that's why consciousness can move through this. It's not just a machine, right? It is alive. And that's not fair to machines. Actually, machines are alive too. I always wonder about that. This question about are robots going to be alive or whatever? That just seems like such a strange, subject-object game that doesn't make much sense to me. I remember a bunch of years ago, Tricycle that's a Buddhist magazine, had a little interview about artificial intelligence, and it was really interesting because what's the Buddhist viewpoint on this? And all these eminent Buddhist teachers were like, well, everything's conscious. And so if we make a machine that can make, tell the difference between red and blue, I don't need to question whether it really sees red and blue. Of course it's alive. Why would we need to divide it? Why would we need to divide it in that way? So maybe look to the Buddhists for creating the artificial intelligence that destroys humanity. Anyway, getting off track there. So let me just say this, and then we'll have time for a few questions if there's anything. The aperture of consciousness that I was speaking of before, this is the question of true seeing. And it's a red herring when we start thinking about how do I see the Buddha? How do I get a hold of the marks of a Buddha? How do I understand what that objective Buddha is? Right? Either outside of me or inside of me. But if we give up on trying to know the Buddha, to know awakening, then we give up on receiving the teachings of the Dharma that are going to transform the way it is that we see. So this kind of very confusing way of talking about things is inviting us into unhooking from the objectification and investing in the seeing itself, rather than investing in the externalization of the object. That the aperture itself is an invitation to this vital road in which we don't look for the nest to kind of hang out in, but we can practice that gift, or we can practice that generosity, which is always coming and going. Right? It's always moving through that aperture, the gift. It's always extending beyond what I think is my body and receiving from what I think is beyond my body. And that's why it's hard to measure, because that body of merit, that merit that goes beyond the limitations that we place on things, it is always flowing in and out. And so it appears as things, and it doesn't appear as no things. And both of those things are what we have to pay attention to if we want to keep in this opportunity for the knowing, which is not a place. It's not a final thing, but it is like the knowing that is familiarity. Now, if I say I know Kogen, no one thinks I know everything about Kogen. They know that I know who Kogen is. I'm familiar with him. So that kind of knowledge, is really different than the grasp. So, I encourage you to see. Any questions? Hi.
As you're talking, I was thinking about in the various sutras where they talk about the 32 marks of a Buddha, and they were this sort of idealized human, with the perfect skin color and the hair and all the other things. And part of me's thinking, well, what's the point of that? And then another part of me is thinking, well, no one would ever look like that. So with that kind of appearance would be something that no one would ever have seen, or would be perhaps ungraspable for humans that lived at that time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So those 32 marks are part of really, that's a big part of what's happening in the Diamond Sutra. It's one of the reasons that it got separated into 32 chapters.
Oh, that's right.
Because the prince, in the Chinese prince who was so devoted to this, he did that, right? He divided it in that way. So that's really central. One of the things I think is important for us is to realize that sight is not, I've been talking about it tonight just in terms of like the metaphor of physical sight. But we have a capacity of sight which is, I think, traditionally called otherworldly. So we can see into realms that are not this realm. So I would say many, many beings have seen that Buddha, that 16-foot golden Buddha, with all of the big earlobes and the curl of hair on the forehead and the lump on the top of the head, and there's 32 of them. I can't remember all 32, but all of those characteristics. Some Buddhists have taken up the very serious discipline of seeing that Buddha, not to try to make that Buddha a objective physical reality within the world that we share right here, but within the many realms that we live in. And I think it's a kind of poverty of modern human, or humans now that live in modernity, that we have restricted and retracted the world that we live in into this layer that we are so invested in. It's a very thin layer, and one of the prime ways we stay stuck there, or we just stay limited to that, is our constant investment in objectification of materiality. So we invest in this. Now, I'm not saying that science doesn't work. I want to be really clear about that. Science super works, and it works in one realm. And the better and better and better we get at science and technology, the more and more we invest in that realm. And that has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. COVID vaccines are an advantage, right? But there are also a bunch of disadvantages. And so when we're thinking about this vision, one of the things that I'd really encourage people is to, when we talk about it, we can just talk about it in this world, because that's something that we share more easily, but that we should also expand that to other places. But what the Buddha is saying here about attributes also is true in those realms. So when he's talking to Subhuti, he says, what do you think? Can the Buddha be seen by attributes? And Subhuti says, no. He's not just talking about the material realm. He's not just saying, oh yeah, I know those people from 1,000 years ago, they had such weird ideas about things and they weren't very advanced. So they came up with this idea that a Buddha had 32 marks, but oh, come on. I mean, that's sort of what modernity says, right? That's not what Subhuti is saying. He's saying, no, in all of those realms, even if we were able to see a Buddha with those 32 marks, that still wouldn't be how we recognize the Buddha, by grasping onto those marks. So in Tantra, for example, where people, if you practice Tantric Buddhism or just Tantra, it's actually not difficult to see many miraculous things. But in those realms too, we have to practice the same thing. Every night when we dream, we're invited into that realm. Yeah. I'm just sort of talking askew of what you said, but
yeah, it's okay, because it's just an interesting thing to explore. I think from kind of I'm thinking a lot about the. I think I'm getting the words right. Not necessarily imagination, but imaginal.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about that world.
Yeah. That
that I'm perceiving that people of centuries past have had more access to that, or we've cut ourselves off from it, or something.
Right.
So.
Right. One question could be like, how do we like, if it's a clear day and you're lucky enough to see the South Sister, how do you regard the South Sister? For millennia, a mountain such as that was regarded as a goddess.
Yeah.
But now people go, like stomping up to the top of that thing.
Yeah, and the important thing is to get to the top of it.
Right.
And that's all that's important.
Right, and we know, we've all been schooled. We know
Sure.
about the volcanoes, and we know this and that. So now the South Sister could very easily
It's been reduced to that.
simply become that, our understanding of that. And so, why the Diamond Sutra isn't calling that out directly in the first 5 chapters, as you read farther on, the Diamond Sutra will say things like, the Buddha will say to Subhuti, he'll say, so what if all of these worlds were filled with myriad jewels, every kind of precious jewel? And in a way, it's just a metaphor, right? But it's also something else. It's actually, what would it mean for us to see all of the worlds as jewels? That's a question that we can, that
Probably wouldn't
this
beat up
asks
the
us.
world as badly as we do, for one.
Yeah.
But,
It's true. Anyone else? Hi.
several cuts.
There's a condition that people can have with certain brain damage where they lose their ability to visually recognize objects.
Yeah.
So they can name its attributes, but won't be able to tell you what it is.
Yeah.
They can name like the clear, that you show them the glass, they tell you all the attributes, but
Yeah.
they can't tell you it is the glass.
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder if that extends to your metaphor. But I had another comment on just what you just said.
Yeah.
And I actually disagree with what you said about science.
Uh-huh.
And I think that science is very mystical and that scientific insights come from that other realm.
Come from the...
The other realm.
Could you say more about that?
Not 3D space. You know, like this realm of disembodied
Right.
and mystical space.
That the scientific insights come from there?
Yeah.
But what do you mean by that?
It's like, you know, the void where everything comes from. You know, it comes from there. It's not like, you said, I forget what your comment was, it was like, it only applies to this dimension, or something like that. That's not how I see it.
We may have just a disagreement there. Yeah. I think where I'm aiming on that is the quantifiable empiricism demands a consistent outcome, and that my familiarity with these realms is that they don't require the consistent outcome. So that would be the place that I'd be taking aim at, not where they emerge from, but maybe how they're applied. Does that make any sense or touch anything?
I mean, I think recognition requires consistency in any domain.
So that would be just my point, is that the insistent on recognition or experience is a certain aspect of realities. I wouldn't even say reality. It's a certain aspect of realities, but it's not the only one. But we could. I don't mean to put you on the spot too much, but that would be interesting conversation to keep going.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think that, well, I guess one way to say it would be like, as we increase our awareness and expanding that metaphor of seeing, but not recognizing, I mean, how much do we see that we don't recognize? And as we recognize it, the scientific description emerges around it. And to me, that seems beyond this physical plane.
Oh, yeah. I could see that. I would agree there. How about the poetic description of it?
It is poetry. I mean, you know, Maxwell's equations are mathematical poetry.
So, but would you say all poetry could be reduced to a scientific explanation?
I guess I just don't see it as a reduction.
So that's my bone to pick with the scientific mindset, is that it has the hubris to believe that it can swallow all domains. Is how I feel about it. Yeah.
Not always.
Yeah.
I think that's a common mentality, but that's not at the heart of science.
Yeah. But you said that a scientific explanation could account for the truth of poetry. Are you saying that?
No.
Or could explain it, or?
I don't think science really explains that much. I don't think that's its purpose.
Well, think the attempt to, I'm not saying you're doing this, but I think they oftentimes where the bone that I have to pick is a reductionist mentality.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take, for example, poetry, then do we just say these are completely different domains and they don't ever touch each other? Or do we say one could explain the other, or could they dance with each other, or could they relate? I think that that's the realm that I have concern about, and so we could.
I would say the relationship between science and poetry is that they're both forms of art.
Wonderful. Maybe we could just say it's all art then, and not need one to be the winner.
Hey, Joe, you have a minute still?
Sure.
I want to make an observation. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
And then, or at least just kind of try this observation out, and then you can tell me how wrong I am. Okay. So it seems to me one of the pieces that's missing in our 5 chapters of the Diamond Sutra so far that seem to make things more mysterious than they need to be is the question of where consciousness comes from, in terms of consciousness doesn't just show up in an individual person. Consciousness emerges through the relationship between 2 people, 2 or more people, and the world around them. That without communication, without 2 people attempting to find some way to share the uniqueness of their experience of the world, create a mark that they can agree in some way helps them understand each other, there is no consciousness. And so it seems to me like the power and the beauty of the Diamond Sutra is to keep reminding us that objectification isn't a problem, to the extent that that is literally the means by which we can come to some shared understanding of experience which permits consciousness. And if we don't have that shared understanding, which is essentially a kind of objectification, it requires a mark, a gesture, a word, some kind of sign or symbol that 2 people can use to co-orient themselves in terms of each other's experience of the world. Without that, we can't, there is no consciousness that will be given, that will arise. The problem becomes, once we have this relational shared understanding of an experience, the tendency is then to reify that as the only way to understand something. And that becomes the problem, and it also becomes the way in which language gets fixed and turned into something rigid and delusional, instead of something always possible, kind of open to change and adjustment and connection to the shifting quality of how we engage and experience the world around us.
Yeah, so that's why the attributes and the no attributes.
The attributes are very handy, because the attributes are the things that we share between each other. That they are literally the marks that allow us to have consciousness and allow us to kind of be in relationship and have some sort of awareness, or kind of like intellectual awareness of what's going on. Yeah. But if we believe the attribute is the thing, and not just one of an infinite number of ways of approaching the thing, then we've lost the amazing and infinite potentiality of the experience of each thing.
Yeah. Only thing I would say that my understanding is a little different is I don't think they have to be humans. And that I don't think that the consciousness is confined to what we would consider the conventional realm. I don't think we have to go far beyond it to understand the miraculousness of it, but I also think that that there is a way in which the I'm using that kind of loosely, the conventional realm is a reflection of something that's happening in all kinds of realms that are less conventional, and we see a certain refraction of it as what we think of as the conventional realm, which can go to, pretty unconventional places the more and more we examine it. And in fact, it is not really separate from those other realms, so that part I think there could be some expansion on. But it's interesting to think, like, what does it even mean to be able to experience anything? That's part of what's being called into question here. And to kind of ground this in Buddhist practice, that's actually what we're doing when we sit in meditation, is that we are regarding experience not as a given, that like the march of experiences that are arising in me, through me, are reality. That's not that march of attributes is simply that. It's a march of attributes. It isn't reality. So sometimes we think that in meditation, people will say, "Oh, you sit and then let go of all these extraneous thoughts, and then you'll see things just as they are," as if all of the extra stuff would go away and there would just be this thing left that you would see. I think that's a kind of misunderstanding. That can be helpful if we need to kind of just calm down a little bit, but actually something more profound is happening there, which is that addiction to the investment in the attributes as being the reality of consciousness is being loosened, and the possibility to encounter myriad beings, all those beings that we say we're going to save, becomes possible because of the loosening of that addiction to the march of the attributes that we put ourselves into. I'm looking at you, but not really, because you're up there.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So we really can. I mean, where like this sort of stuff can become very heady. The reason that philosophers all over the world in past 20 or 30 years have started to read Dogen with real deep interest, non-Buddhist philosophers, and the reason is because someone like him that had that faculty with language and the way to think about things. Not everyone should have that. The world would be probably, we wouldn't have good ice cream if that was the case. We'd have good essays, philosophical essays, but not other things. But with that kind of person who has that mind, who then threw themselves completely into this practice, then they could create these ways of talking about things that have a high level of complexity. But our job then is to take those and to bring those back into what is my path, not just what is my experience, because the experience, remember, that's the attributes, but we also have to think about what is the no attributes, and so whenever it is that we're caring for the experiences we have, we should also hold it lightly. Not, it's my experience, but it's my experience. Like if it's resting on your hand here, then the attributes of that experience are also surrounded by all kinds of air, which are not the attributes of the thing it is that you're experiencing. So both of those, that posture, both of those happen at the same time. That's the balanced state of practice. That is very clearly presented to us in the first chapter.